If you want to learn how to make a top-down dungeon crawler, something inspired by classics like Gauntlet and even Diablo, something that has path-finding enemies and area of effect explosions, something that was the beginning of my own dungeon crawler game, a top-down, couch co-op, action RPG with randomly generated levels and multiple player characters, then keep watching and I'll show you how. G'day gamers, last episode we improved the look of the game by adding tiles and automated the adding of the collision instances, allowing the entities to stay within the corridors. But now the player is definitely outnumbered, so to help them out, this episode we will add a bomb the player can throw towards the enemies. The bomb will then explode, damaging all who are in its range and knocking them back. I designed a very similar system for Keepers of Pyrite. Here's an example of many enemies spawning in and following the player, and you can see the bomb is thrown in a similar way. It bounces a little bit though before exploding, but it damages the enemies and pushes them away. They also get stunned a little, which allows the player some breathing room. Now all the concepts I've shown in this series are used in a similar way for this game. The player has a bow, just like our guy, but I'm not using it as much because I'm not trying to kill them. But the last thing I do is a special move, it kills a few, and it gives enough experience to level up and finish off the rest. So the first thing to do is to add the bomb. So I'm just going to place it in objects here. And if you look in the resources, there's an sbomb.gif. So just drag that over. And we can just set the origin to be the middle center. And I'm going to go and change the collision mask. And I'm going to set it to manual. And we'll just make it a little bit smaller, so that the collisions against the wall are just on the bomb itself. So if we right click, we can create an object for this. Just obomb, and we'll drag that sprite over. So we'll just add a create event. And in here, we're going to put these variables. So we have our horizontal and our vertical speed. Now we need to add that HSP and VSP values to our X and Y every step, and that allows the bomb to move. But we also need to apply some drag so the bomb can slow down over time. And we already have a function that does exactly that. So if we go and look at our enemy, and specifically the enemy parent, and we can see that there is a move state and we have a calc entity movement, and that does exactly that. So if we go and have a look, actually we've got a few scripts here. These 3 scripts, I can hold down control and select them. We'll just make sure we put them into scripts. And this calc entity movement, so this applies our HSP and our VSP to our X and our Y, and it does some slowdown in the horizontal and in the vertical. So this is a great function to use for the bomb. So I'll take a copy of that, and then back in our bomb, we'll add a step event, and then just here we can execute a script, and we'll just execute that calc entity movement. Now I also want to set the depth, and just here under set instance variable, there's a depth. I'm going to set it to -y. Basically Gamemaker draws instances based on their depth. So using -y as the depth means objects that are higher up the screen, which have smaller y values, will be drawn first. And this gives the illusion of depth because another instance down lower is going to be drawn over top of it. So this is a little trick when you put the depth as -y, it's great for a top-down game. And we need this in the step event because it has to run every step to adjust the depth to the y value of the instance. Now, if you look at the bomb, if you look at the sprite, I should have played this to show you that it's a little bit of a tick down and it gets to that point and then we want it to explode. So if we go back to our bomb, basically we can add an animation end event. And just in here, what we want to do when the bomb has finished counting down is to make an explosion, because that's when we want to damage any entity. So at this point, we can create an instance called O_explosion. And we just want to create that at X and Y. So make sure these are ticked, and instances layer is fine. And then after it's created the explosion, then we can destroy the bomb. So by making the explosion the object that damages entities, we can then use this explosion object in other cases when we need to do damage to multiple entities. So I don't want to add the code directly into this bomb event. By putting it in an object, we can then reuse that code later on. So the next thing to do is create the explosion. So let's go into our objects. And if you bring up the resources, there is an S Sonic Explosion sprite. Let's drag that in. Now I'm going to press F2 and just rename this to just S Explosion. That'll be fine. And we get rid of the strip 9 at the end, but the strip 9 enables us to automatically add frames for a PNG file, but it doesn't bring in the frame rate. So I'm going to change this frame rate to 14, and I'm going to set the origin to be the middle center. So that looks great. Now the reason I didn't make this a GIF is because there's some alpha values and they won't work in a GIF file. So the collision mask for this one is set at automatic and it's quite large. Instead, I'm going to set it to manual and I'm going to set it to ellipse. And then I'm going to drag this based on the widest amount that the explosion occurs at. So the initial explosion is just here. So I want to drag this down and just cover that initial explosion just like so. So then we can use this mask to work out what entities are damaged by the explosion. Now your sprite might not be the same size as mine. If yours is not this size, you can click on the size here and just here under scale image, you can change this to 50% and you can make it 142 and just click apply. Now when you do that, you'll have to go back into the mask and set it again though. So let's create an object and then we can assign this sprite to that object and it's just called O Explosion. We'll drag this over. I just wanted to take a break and appreciate who makes these videos possible. This month, my legendary supporters are Andy K, Big Honk, Jake Dowds, and HK Pig. I have a new platformer course coming out shortly. Legendary supporters will all receive a free code to access the course. If you want to show your appreciation, you can do so over on the Patreon site. Now let's continue. Now, before I do the code for the explosion, I want to create the code that allows the player to throw the bomb. That way it'll be easier to check that code, make sure it's working, and then we can check the explosion code and make sure that's working too. It's better to break things down into small steps. That way you can make sure each piece is working before moving on to the next one. So how are we going to make the player throw? So if you go into our scripts, we already have a check fire function. And in here, this is what we use to check if the player has pressed the button and if they can attack, and then we create all the attack there. So we can have a similar thing, basically called check bomb. So under our scripts, let's make a new one called check bomb. And in here, we'll run the same check as we do for the player firing. But let's also make some new variables. So just in the player, let's go to the create event and let's add some variables for throwing the bomb. So just down here, I'm going to add these variables. We have our can throw bomb. So can the player throw it now? It's going to be true or false. We have a bomb cooldown, which is how long until the bomb's ready to throw again. And we have bomb power, which is how far we throw the bomb. So back over in our script. Now the first thing I'm going to check is, did the player press the button? And I'm going to use a mouse pressed, and it's going to be the right mouse button. So if they press the button, and if our can throw bomb is true, remember I don't need to write is true, because if it's true, this is going to run anyway. And I'm just going to add this code. So first we set our can throw bomb to false, so that we can't throw it again. And then I'm going to set an alarm to our bomb cooldown, and that'll reset our can throw bomb for next time. Now we need to know which direction to throw it. So we declare a temporary variable just called dir, and it's the direction towards the mouse. Then we can create the bomb. Now I'm going to put a target here, and I wanted to show you that if you do write _inst here for our target, if you press enter, what happens is the sequence instance value from the predictive text is what is replaced there. You just want to make sure you click away so it doesn't select that variable. Now we have the ID of the bomb that's created. So we're going to use an apply to or a with in GML. and we're going to apply it to that underscore inst. Once again, don't press enter, just click away. And inside the apply to, or the with for GML, is just going to be an assigned variable code block, and we're setting the HSP of the bomb and the VSP to our length dir x, length dir y, and the length is our bomb power. And you got to make sure you write other.bomb power because we're inside the instance that we created, but the bomb power is coming from the player's variable. So that's why we write other, and the direction is just our underscore dir, which we calculated up here. So we now need to go and create this alarm too. So back in our player, we can add an alarm too. And in here, we just want to add our can throw bomb variable, and we want to set it to true. And that'll enable the player to throw it again. So the other thing we need to do is just inside the player's step event, and we'll just make this big. So where the player is moving after we do our check fire, we can take a copy of this and paste it again. And this time we're checking for bomb. So let's press play and test that out. So now when we right click, we get a bomb moving and exploding, and a few things going on. Firstly, it never disappears. Secondly, it doesn't actually do any damage. And that's, of course, we haven't done any of that code yet. So that's working at least, and we can throw the bomb, but we need to stop it from going through walls and also stop that animation from continuing to play. So inside our bomb, we can stop the collisions pretty easily. We just add a collision event with our solid. And we just have to run the script called collision. Great, let's press play and test that again. So now when we throw the bomb, you can see what actually happens. It doesn't actually bounce off the walls, it just slides along. And also, obviously, we need to stop these continuing explosions. So for the bouncing, what I like to do is not just use collision, but actually make a collision bounce function. And that's because there'll be other instances that you want to bounce off walls as well. And if you make a bounce function, you can just use that instead of the normal collision. So let's go make a new script, and we'll just call this collision bounce. And just inside here, we want to change this, and it's not just collision now, but it's collision bounce. Now, of course, nothing's going to work yet because we need to add some code in here. And all I'm going to do is actually run the standard collision script. And I'm doing that because what will happen is when this runs, it'll place the bomb right next to a solid. And all we have to do is check if it's next to a solid. And if it is, we can just make it bounce off by reversing the direction that it's moving. So we're going to need a if object at place code block. And we're going to need an assign variable code block. So we don't need these or this. We can just make this have a little bit more room. So this collision will just run our standard collision, and it moves us flush with any walls we collided with. Then we'll use this one to check if there's a solid 1 pixel in the horizontal direction we are moving. And if it is, we can reverse our HSP and move away from it instead, and that'll make it look like it's bouncing. So we can do that by looking for a collision with our OSolid at our current X and Y, but 1 pixel in the direction we are moving, and we can do that with sign of HSP. And if a collision's found, well, therefore this will run, and all I want to do is set our HSP to be minus HSP. So if it finds a wall, it'll just reverse our HSP. Now I want to do the same for the Y, so let's select both of those, take a copy, and then just paste them below. Now make sure you drag this so it's pasted there. And this time we're checking if it's 1 pixel in the vertical direction. And if so, we reverse our VSP to move away. So we can get rid of this. This is a 0. And the Y is our sign of VSP. And if a collision is found, down here, we change our HSP to VSP. So let's press play and we should see that our bomb bounces off the wall. All right, just like that. And that works great. I just wanted to pause quickly to acknowledge the epic supporters for this month. They are Sky Devil Palm, Paul LeBlanc, Robert Churches, Pseudo, Sir Peter, Chris LeBlanc, Anthony Sanderson, Sadface, Dennis Evans, Nick, Alex Wachowski, Apex Aliens, Joseph Carmelo, Cloudy, Marlo Dobb, Joshua Barfield, Rustic, Rowdy Coda, Jargon P, Sarek Dezen, Dong Bruley, Sky Kitten, Slobbery B, Raymond Holler, and Kermit de Hoyo. Thank you very much for your support. It's greatly appreciated. Now back to the video. So now we need a way for the explosion to actually damage entities and to stop it continually playing. And both those problems are solved at the same time, basically. So let's go to our explosion. And let's add a create event. And let's just add these variables. So we have a force, which is how much the explosion knocks entities back. And we have the damage that is dealt to the entity. So now we can make a collision event with the O entity parent. And in that collision event, we can firstly push the entities back away from the center of the explosion using that force variable. And we can also damage the entities using our damage entity script to apply the damage. So the first thing I'm going to add are some temporary variables. And the first one is the dir, which is the direction from the explosion to the entity. And then it's a force variable, and I'm just setting that as a local variable just for ease of use. Now remember, these are just temporaries, you can declare them as. So now we can push the entity back using that direction and the force, and length dir will do that for us. Now make sure you use your apply to or your with. And what you want to do is apply this to the other, and that is the entity in this collision. So I'm going to use a function call here, and I'm going to drag it just here on that side to make sure it's applied to correctly. And what we want to do here is just push the entity away horizontally. Now, this is just another way to apply length dir. You can run the function and then the arguments of force and dir, and you can set a target for the output. So I'm going to take a copy of this and paste it and just change this to Y. And we're pushing the entity away vertically. Then also make sure you just change that to VSP. So that'll push the entity away from the explosion. The other thing to do is to execute a script and just drop that under there. And this time we want to execute our damage entity script. So if we look at damage entity, it has a target ID, a source ID, a damage, and the time is how long they're knocked back for. So our target is our other. Our source is our ID, which is the actual explosion itself. Our damage is just our damage variable. And how long they're knocked for? Well, I'm going to do a random range between, say, 45 and 60. And as you know, this is to damage the entity. Now, if we run this, the problem with this code is while the animation is playing, this collision event is running every step, and it's applying it to the entity that it collides with every step. So it's going to be dealing damage to them every step. So we need a way for this collision code to only run once, but only once it's run against any entity it's colliding with for that step. Now I could use a flag variable, which is kind of just like a Boolean, whereas I go in here and I put a check. So I'd have a variable called, say, apply damage. And if we apply damage, then what we do is take all of this and we apply it like so. And then we could set this to false and no one else would be damaged. But there's a problem with that method. And that's the collision event would still run each step while the animation plays out. So it's quite inefficient because collision events are something you want to avoid as much as you can. So I don't want to do that. Instead, a better method would be to just not draw this object and instead draw the explosion sprite in an empty object just for the look of it. and we can then destroy this explosion object so it doesn't waste resources running a collision per step. And it's quite easy to do because we just go over and we create an O_die object. And inside here, we have an animation end event. And in the animation end event, we simply destroy the instance. Now, there's no sprite assigned to this, and that's because you want to do it when you create it, because you can use this for lots of different things. Now, the only issue though is, when do we destroy the explosion? How do we know it's run its collision event against every entity? Because when you look at the collision event, the question becomes, when does that run? Well, without getting too complicated, there is an order of events that Gamemaker has. And the order of events is as follows. When the step event runs, then the collision event runs, and then the end step event runs. So there's an extra step event which runs after the normal step event called the end step event. So it can be a little confusing because there is a step event here, and there's a begin step, end step, and your normal step. But Gamemaker also refers to the word step to say that that's 1 frame out of 60 per second that runs. And inside that step, you have the step event running, the begin step, the end step, and the draw event has all of these as well as other events run at different times. Now, because the end step runs after the collision, we can add an end step, and in here we can create that O_die explosion. And let's create the O_die here. And we're just creating it at X and Y. And for the layer, I'm just going to put it on the same layer that the bomb's on, which is just layer. And you don't need this inside quote marks because there is a variable called layer. It's a built-in one, and that's the one I'm using. Now we want to assign it to inst, and it's going to be a temporary variable. And we're doing that to then assign the sprite. So there is a set sprite, or in GML, you can just set the sprite index directly, but we want to set it to that s_explosion sprite. Now we just need to make sure that we select our inst _inst, and that will apply that sprite to the O_die instance. Now the last thing to do is just destroy this explosion, because at this point we've already passed on our damage. Okay, so let's press play and test that out. So now when we throw this, we get our explosion and it pushes the enemies back. Now I'm staying out of it because it actually will damage the player as well, like that. So that looks great, but I did notice a problem with the depth. And if I go and have a look at the sprite for the bomb, the origin of the sprite is the middle center. And what that means is that's where the depth is being set at. Now, normally in my games, I actually place the Y position or the origin down the bottom, and that's so I can do some squash and stretch when the object bounces on the ground. But if you place it here, you want to place your depth as the B box bottom value. So in here under the bomb, where we're doing the setting of the depth, instead of -Y, I'm going to set it to -B box bottom. And also it reminds me that the player actually doesn't have a depth set. So if we copy that and then we go into our scripts, if we look at the enemy anim down the bottom, we're actually setting the depth for the enemy, but we're never doing this for the player. So in the anim script for the player, so just here, let's paste in a setting for the depth, and that'll make sure the player is drawn in the correct position in relation to the other entities and objects in the game. So if we test that out, a bit hard to tell at the moment, but you can really tell when the enemies have died because the player was walking on top of them before. So it's kind of fun to grab up a bunch of enemies here too in this game and sort of see if you can explode them all at once, because it's kind of satisfying to do. But you actually got to hit them, which I've missed at that point. So there we go. When they push back, it's kind of fun to see. Let's see if we can get some more of them here. And they bounce around. But if we kill them here and then have a look at their bodies, now the player is now walking in front and behind correctly, which they weren't doing before. So the other thing you might notice is the bodies don't disappear and they actually still interact with the bomb. And you may want that for a while, but eventually you're going to slow your game down if you've got a lot of enemies. So over on Patreon, I'll show you how to make your enemies disappear over time and it's just a little thing that will make your game a little better. The last thank you is to my rare Patreon members who generously have given to help keep the tutorials flowing. So thanks for watching. I'll talk to you in the next one.